They thought living in a quiet neighborhood meant peace. But for one homeowner, it turned into a nightmare. Imagine waking up to find your property invaded, your rights ignored, and your sense of security ripped away, all because of an HOA board drunk on power. What started as a petty complaint spiraled into an outrageous act that left the entire community stunned. But here's the twist: the very thing they tried to control wasn't just any property. It carried a secret they never saw coming. So what happens when their arrogance collides with the law? At first glance, the neighborhood looked like the kind of place anyone would dream of calling home. Tree-lined streets curved gently through the subdivision, kids rode their bikes in the late afternoon sun, and carefully trimmed lawns gave off an air of order and comfort. It was the kind of community that promised stability, safety, and a sense of belonging. For Mark and his family, moving here felt like a milestone. He had worked years to afford a home in a neighborhood like this, a quiet cul-de-sac, a spacious garage, and the kind of backyard where weekend barbecues became tradition. Life was simple, predictable, and good. The neighbors waved politely, the mail always arrived on time, and even the local HOA newsletters seemed harmless enough, filled with announcements about community events and landscaping tips. At least, that's how it seemed in the beginning. What most people don't realize about communities like this is that beneath the surface, under all the friendly smiles and perfectly painted fences, lies a current of control. The HOA wasn't just a group of volunteers helping to keep the neighborhood tidy. It was a board of people who thrived on rules, regulations, and power. For some, enforcing those rules was more than a duty, it was an obsession. Mark didn't notice it at first. He was too busy settling in, unpacking boxes, and watching his kids race each other down the driveway. But slowly, little things began to catch his attention. A warning note about the color of his trash bins. A reminder about parking only on the right side of the street. A friendly notice about trimming a hedge that barely brushed the sidewalk. On their own, they seemed harmless, but together, they painted a picture of an HOA that wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Still, Mark brushed it off. Every neighborhood has its quirks, he told himself. He paid the dues, kept his lawn in check, and tried not to think too much about the occasional nitpicky complaint. After all, he had bigger things to focus on, like his work, his family, and the dream of turning his new house into a true home. But the calm was short-lived. The HOA had already taken notice of something they couldn't ignore, something that didn't fit into their picture-perfect version of the community. And while Mark had no idea at the time, that small detail would spark a conflict that would spiral far beyond late fees and warning letters. Because tucked away in Mark's garage was a vehicle that the HOA considered a violation. But in reality, it was something far more important, something tied to law enforcement, safety, and a responsibility the board could never have imagined. For weeks, Mark convinced himself that the notes, the warnings, and the little slips of paper left in his mailbox were just routine. After all, every HOA had rules, and maybe this one was simply stricter than most. But as the days turned into months, the pattern became harder to ignore. At first, it was about the trash bins. One morning, he found a notice taped to his front door, "Violation, bins visible from the street." Mark shook his head. He'd tucked them neatly beside the garage, out of the way, but apparently not far enough to satisfy the board's definition of hidden. He moved them deeper into the corner, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Next came the grass. Mark prided himself on keeping his yard neat. He mowed every Saturday, watered regularly, and even trimmed the hedges into clean lines. But a letter arrived anyway: "Violation, lawn exceeds acceptable length." He measured it himself. It was barely taller than 1.5 inches. Still, the letter carried a fine. Small, but Mark felt the first real stab of anger. This wasn't about bins or grass anymore. This was about his job, his livelihood, and something far bigger than neighborhood appearances. He ignored the letter, confident they'd back down once they realized what the Jeep was. But the board didn't back down. Instead, the harassment escalated. Every week, another notice. Another fine. Another demand. At first, Mark laughed it off, tossing the papers into a growing pile on his kitchen counter. But soon, the letters grew sharper, more threatening. Words like escalation, legal action, and seizure appeared in bold print. Still, Mark refused to budge. That's when the HOA changed tactics. One afternoon, while Mark was away on assignment, A neighbor texted him a photo that made his stomach drop. His Jeep, the government Jeep, sat with a bright orange sticker slapped across the windshield, unauthorized vehicle. Subject to removal. His pulse quickened. Who had put it there? How had they dared touch it? When he got home, the sticker was gone, but the message was clear. The HOA wasn't just threatening anymore. They were circling. The next week, things turned personal. A board member, a woman the neighbors had nicknamed Karen for her sharp tongue and relentless interference, showed up at his door. She stood with a clipboard in hand, her smile tight and artificial. "We've given you plenty of warnings," she said, her voice clipped. "That Jeep has to go. It violates community standards." Mark kept his composure. "It's authorized," he replied firmly. "And frankly, it's none of your concern." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." From that day on, Karen made it her mission. She snapped photos whenever the Jeep was parked outside, reported him to the board at every meeting, and even confronted his wife in the driveway with pointed comments about rules being rules. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was a campaign. The fines doubled. The letters came daily now. And through it all, Mark held his ground. But the board's obsession reached its breaking point one quiet evening. Mark returned home late from work, the sun already down, the street eerily still. As he pulled into the cul-de-sac, his headlights caught something that made his blood run cold. The lock on his driveway gate, the heavy-duty one he'd installed for security, dangled in pieces. Cut clean through. The Jeep was gone. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The empty space. The jagged remains of the lock. The silence pressing in all around. Then the truth slammed into him. Someone had taken it. Within an hour, the Jeep was located. A private tow yard contracted by the HOA had it impounded, sitting behind chain-link fencing like any other repossessed car. But this wasn't any other car. And when federal agents explained that to the owner of the lot, his face drained of color. The Jeep was released immediately, without a single question asked. But retrieving the vehicle was only half the story. The real confrontation was still waiting, and Mark knew exactly where it would happen. That evening, the HOA held its monthly meeting. Residents gathered in the clubhouse, a beige, carpeted room decorated with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, discussions of landscaping budgets, holiday decorations, and the occasional noise complaint. But tonight, the air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone had heard rumors. Everyone had seen the black cars. Everyone knew something was about to happen. At the front of the room sat the board, with Karen in her usual seat, clipboard in hand, chin raised as though she were presiding over court. She called the meeting to order with her trademark smile, polite, but sharp enough to cut. Agent Collins placed a hand on the folder. "This board authorized an illegal action. You trespassed on private property, destroyed personal security equipment, and seized a vehicle tied to active operations. Do you have any idea what the consequences of that could be?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support from the other board members. None came. Mark leaned forward, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You wanted control. You wanted to prove your power. Well, congratulations. Now you're on record with federal law enforcement." Karen tried to maintain her grip on authority. In the days after the meeting, she sent out long-winded emails to residents, claiming the whole incident was a miscommunication blown out of proportion. She insisted the board had acted in the best interest of property values, and that all decisions were made in accordance with HOA procedures. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. Neighbors petitioned for her removal. A recall vote was scheduled, and on that night, the room filled to capacity. Neighbors lined the walls, some standing outside the door just to be part of the moment. When the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. Karen was out. Her departure didn't come quietly. She slammed her clipboard on the table, muttered about ungrateful neighbors, and stormed out of the clubhouse. But her reign was over, and the neighborhood exhaled in relief. Mark stood in his driveway weeks later, the Jeep safely returned, his children riding bikes again on the quiet street. His wife smiled beside him, and for the first time in months, the air felt calm. The HOA had thought they could bend the rules to their will. They thought they could intimidate, bully, and control. But they had underestimated the one man they targeted, and the law standing behind him. And soon, the entire neighborhood would learn what happens when arrogance meets accountability.